We're live, sir.
Okay, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Start.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this evening's Colors of Glory virtual meet. I am Aparna Chandrasekharan, a life member of the Colors of Glory Foundation and your MC for this event. Today's event is one in a series of virtual meets we have been hosting since the pandemic set in 2020, the frequency of which has widened after we have resumed our in-person events in June last year. While the regular attendees of our events do not need to be told what our organization is about, kindly bear with me through a brief introduction for the sake of the new attendees, whom we are delighted to welcome. Traditionally, our country never lacked organizations celebrating our heritage in almost every sphere of human activity, be it art, literature, or politics. However, for whatever reasons, warfare alone does not really enjoy this privilege, despite our rich military legacy. It is this grave anomaly that our founders set out to rectify by raising Colors of Glory Foundation, the first of its kind in India, 7 years ago. Today, we are proud to assert that we have carved a niche for ourselves, celebrating the heroism of our men and women in arms, past and present, through innumerable events, outdoor and indoor, varying from battle reenactments to exhibitions and commemorative marathons, to documentary shows and intercollegiate and interschool military history quizzes, as well as talks and seminars. We even made a virtue out of the setback with the virtual events we started during the pandemic by reaching out to a wider national audience. Our All India online intercollegiate military history quizzes have become so popular that we have students from as far as Jammu and Arunachal Pradesh participating. In fact, the top honors during the last 2 consecutive years went to Delhi and Sonepat colleges. Our website features nearly 150 popular blogs, some of which have been published as articles in the Journal of the USI, the United Service Institution of India, the oldest and the most authentic defense publication in the country. We have a pan-Indian membership base of both armed forces veterans and civilian gentry and some overseas members as well. While we are well on our way to bouncing back with in-person events after the pandemic lull and are confident of scaling loftier heights as we go on, we will continue to host the virtual meets to reach out to our national and international audience. We also endeavor to host some in-person outreach programs in other cities in the near future, particularly starting with Bengaluru. Meanwhile, we invite all of you who are not yet members of our organization to join us in our unique mission. Please visit our website to know more about the membership information. I am now delighted to give you all a glimpse of the road we have traveled so far through a short video, which of course is only a part of the story because it depicts major outdoor events that we've hosted, while innumerable indoor and virtual sessions that we've held do not appear in this video. Thank you so much. I now request Air Marshal Varthaman to do the honors of introducing Anchit Gupta. Over to you, Uncle.
Thank you, Aparna. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My warmest regards to Air Marshal BD Jr, who is logged in. Sir, it's really an honor and to have you on our program. Air Marshal Jr was the Commander-in-Chief, was the Deputy Chief of the Air Force, and my first operational squadron was when I joined Air Marshal Jr.'s squadron. It is my honor and privilege to introduce the next generation of our Air Force children, Anchit Gupta. You all have read all his accomplishments, so I will not touch on them. I will touch on the other parts of his accomplishment, and he is so multi-skilled, multi-talented, and so many interests and so many hobbies. It's amazing. Very, very proud to hear of his, narrate his accomplishments. Firstly, he is the son of Group Captain Anil Gupta, who is also logged in here, who is from the 37th Coast Delta Squadron, also a fighter pilot. I think he was perhaps the last pilot to eject out of a Vampire aircraft during our training phase. And though we did not work together in the combat squadrons, I know him very well. And Anchit is married to an army officer's daughter, Colonel V.K. Sood from the 4x9 Gorkha Rifles. Shweta is her name, and they have 2 children. Anchit has done, so many activities. One of the ones when he started was something called the genealogy research on the Kashmiri Pandits. It was a 6-year research program that he conducted all over India, interviewing more than 500 families across the country. And this was part of his genealogy research. His adventurous hobbies are 4-wheel off-road driving. And he's he's taken part in many rallies, and he explores the country on this 4-wheel off-road driving. He's a fitness enthusiast. He's a long-distance cycling enthusiast. And when he finds time, he does long-distance cycling. The major part when we all came to know Anchit was when he started delving into the history of the Indian Air Force. Today, as Air Force guys, we're all Air Force pilots. We cannot narrate the story of 1945-47, and we have to invite Anchit, whose interests are to dig deep into our Air Force history, bring it alive, and then bring it across the country, including the Air Force institutions, if you please, to tell them what our history is. So recently, he conducted such a program in the Air Force Academy in Dundigal, Hyderabad, where he spoke on the Air Force. And the week after, he is going to be speaking at the Chief of Staff conference in at the Air Headquarters, New Delhi. So I was also a chief of staff. I wish we had Anchit to narrate us these stories. So he is deep into our history, and his history is basically what you can see the poster behind, Inspire History Project. Narrate the history in a manner which is reachable, which is in more of a storytelling mode. And hopefully this will cascade to more and more people, and they will be proud of the Indian Air Force history. He is in the process of completing his first book, I would say, and that is on the details of the aircrew who took part in the Kargil War. He's a regular writer, and you'll find him on Twitter, on print, and the Times of India. He lives in Gurgaon with his 2 children. As an Air Force brat, that's what we call if you are an Air Force guy, and we have Aparna here, who's another brat. And when I call all of them as Air Force brats, I happen to be one as well. And it's really a proud privilege to welcome Anchit to our program. You make us proud, and I know you will shine the Air Force flag as the years go by. God bless you. Over to Captain Ramachandran to introduce the subject.
Okay, I think that's pretty good enough introduction.
Yeah.
So, because the rest we have printed, so Anchit, you may please start.
Thank you very much, Captain Ramachandran, first of all, for having me over. It's a great initiative that the organization is taking up in furthering the cause of military history, and it's an honor to add to that in a little bit in terms of this topic for today. Thank you also, Marshal Vardaman, for that very generous introduction. I would say I remain an Air Force kid. The kid may have grown out, the Air Force has not. It's a privilege to be here. The project, or first the topic for today, is quite dear to me, simply because it is something that is not spoken about very often. When we talk about history of Air Force in India, Air Forces in India, we tend to speak about the wars, we tend to speak about the heroes, and we tend to speak about some of the major events that have happened. But we do not tend to talk as much about what really led us to have the organization that we have, or we inherited at the time of independence. Probably the only other person who's speaking a lot about it, and he speaks much better, is K.S. Nair, the noted historian with multiple books on the subject, and he's equally passionate, if not more, about the pre-47 history. Air Marshal Vardaman already spoke about the Inspire History Project. Very briefly to speak about this, it was sometime late last year when I had the privilege of an audience with the Chief of the Air Staff to talk about some of the history initiatives, when he mentioned that can we do something about using history to inspire the youth. Now, whether that is in the Air Force, the officers, the younger officers, or whether it is the public at large. And it is with that the idea was born that should be almost in the way of a bard, do storytelling. And we started off this initiative sometime late last year, talking about a couple of our luminaries. The first one, Meher Singh, and recently at AFA about Arjun Singh. But this is the first time that under the banner, I'm going to talk about a very different subject. Now, bear with me. It's Saturday evening, 7 p.m. All of us should be at a drinking hole, but we are here talking about this. I would try and make sure that we are a little bit interested in the subject, notwithstanding that it goes back about 80 years in time. And I'll try and keep it also quite brief and to the point. Let's first start about how did I even get to know about this topic, or what piqued my interest to talk about this subject or to learn more about this subject. Well, as anybody who starts to delve into Air Force, you can't ignore Air Commodore Meher Singh. And it was when I was studying about Air Commodore Meher Singh that I realized that his MVC decoration has a unit mentioned as number 1 Ops Group. I, for one, had not heard that name in more than 50 years. The last time being somewhere in the 1970s, which was the name given to the, at that time, the predecessor of Southwestern Air Command. That was the last time we had used this name. But why this name? What was its link to 1947 Kashmir War? Why the number 1 and why this bracketed term of ops was something that I was very curious to learn about. As I started to dig a little bit more, I got more confused because I realized that in 1947, the Indian Air Force had 4 wings, or not 1947, but generally around that period by 1948, 49. They had 4 wings. The number 1 wing at Srinagar, the number 2 wing at Lohegaon, the number 3 wing at Palam, and number 4 wing at Agra. Well, they were not formed in chronological order, which is quite rare because the military is quite predictable. They follow a chronology to the T. So this, again, was something that did not quite add up. Also, what did not add up was why these locations. None of these locations were actually the original locations where the air forces in India were set up. Now, before we go down a little further into understanding what had happened, let me just spend half a minute for the civilians on the forum to explain what is the structure of the Air Force in general. At the highest level of organization is the headquarters or the air headquarters. A level lower than that is the command, a level lower the group, a level lower the wing. And then at a unit level, we have squadron, flight, and section, which all of it put together is a flying unit, as the aircraft image suggests. A wing in modern common parlance is equal to a station. There are some nuances around it, but for simplicity, it's a station. A command is like the Western Air Command. We do not have an active group, so I don't have a photo. As I said, the last time we had a group was more than 50 years back. And air headquarters is the image there. We'll be using some of these terms through the talk actively, so I thought I'll put this out up front for some of our civilian friends here on the forum. Now, coming back to the question, where do the wings and the order of the wings and one ops group come in? I searched for years and I couldn't find the answer. Finally, when I found the answer, I realized to make sense of it, I need to rewind all the way back to the beginning of air forces in India. So let us go back to 1919. That is when the RAF formed their first unit in India in terms of the Indian group. The RAF was present in a small measure even before 1919, but it was not structured. The first time it was Air Commodore Webb Bowen, who came in as the AOC. And he remained there for a couple of years, shuttling between Delhi and Shimla. Soon after, just to understand, before we move on, I'll just explain how this worked in the RAF structure. As you all know, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, was from the UK. And the air headquarters equivalent of RAF was called the Air Ministry. When they moved on to be present in countries outside of the UK, they usually made it a command. So Royal Air Force Mediterranean was a command. Royal Air Force Far East was a command. And similarly, Royal Air Force India became a command. So usually what you would find is that a country is a headquarter. But because RAF was a multi-country organization, the country itself was a command. This is the structure that they started to follow in India, by and large, India being a command. Well, just before we get there, let's understand what India was in that era. From an aviation perspective, from a military aviation perspective, it was a small piece of land bordering Afghanistan and Pakistan, just the Northwest Frontier Province. For the first 20 odd years of military aviation, this is all that happened. Well, the easternmost airbase that the air forces in India had was Ambala. There was nothing east of Ambala. Everything else was west. And therefore, all the operations were carried out just in small region where the British were fighting the tribals and the air forces were helping in that endeavor. The setup broadly from 1925 to 1940 reflected this chart. This chart was made somewhere in the late 1920s, where the headquarters of the Air Forces in India has one group, which is called the number 1 Indian group, and a few wings, a few RAF squadrons. This structure didn't really change all the way till 1941. A few stations changed here and there. There was a massive earthquake which wiped down Quetta in 1935, so they had to move that. In 1932, Indian Air Force was formed with one squadron that came into the picture. But by and large, barring these minor changes, the setup had not changed. But do note the name, the number 1 Indian group, Peshawar. We'll come back to this nomenclature. This is the first time we've seen this emerge after speaking about it in the context of Meher Singh. The action really started to happen in late 41. To the left of the image, you will see the number 1 Indian group in the Northwest Frontier Province. In December 1941, 2 new groups were created. The 221 group in Northeast India, based out of Barakpur, having fighter and bomber operations, and the 22 group in Ceylon, the earlier name for Sri Lanka, for maritime duties. Just a note on these numbers. The British system of numbering units and groups was the 100 series, the 200 series, the 300 series. By the time they came to India, most of our groups were numbered in the 220 series. And that is why the 221 is the first number assigned to a group in India. By the end of it, it was somewhere in the 230s when they left India. But the big change that happened was in March 1942, when Air Chief Marshal Richard Pierce was made AOC-in-C of India. He was a very experienced professional, having been AOC-in-C Bomber Command RAF since 1940 and been in the thick of war. The reason these changes were coming in was because the RAF realized that the entire World War II front is moving to the east in Burma, where the Air Forces of India did not have any presence whatsoever. And they had to build something very fast, and they sent a very experienced man to do this. Soon after, in April 1942, the Air Forces in India expanded to being 5 groups. The number 221 group, which had been formed just recently, was broken up into 221 and 224. 221 doing fighter operations and 224 doing bomber operations. To cover Peninsular India, another group 225 was formed. The idea was to cover the peninsula both for maritime as well as in internal security. The Ceylon group remained the same. And within a month of April 42, by May 42, we had another 2 groups come in. We had the 226 group and the 227 group. What we also noticed is that both of these groups were not operational groups. They were maintenance and training groups. The difference, ladies and gentlemen, very simply is an operational group is a fighting unit or a combat unit or a flying unit, simply put. The functional groups of maintenance and training are support units or support groups that help the rest of the groups. It is also at this time to integrate with the global RAF system that the number 1 Indian group in Northwest Frontier Province was renamed as the 223 group. So by May 42, we have 7 groups, all of them integrated into the global system. This had been the most fantastic phase in the development of air forces in India since 1919. In fact, the change happened in bare period of 6 months. It's best described by Michael Pearson in his book, The Burmaier Campaign. He says, prior to 1941, all that the Air Force was doing was supporting the army with some outdated aircraft against operations against restless tribes. Whereas by May 42, it had awakened to be part of a state-of-the-art industrial war, which the army could not do without. That was a sea change for the Air Forces of India. I think a very pivotal point in the history of how aviation, military aviation would move on in the subcontinent. Well, Pierce was not done. Pierce realized very soon that his headquarters in Delhi was way too far off from the action. The action at this moment having shifted to the Far East in Burma. It was therefore that he decided to form another command in Bengal. at Barakpur to be specific, and it was called Air Headquarters Bengal. It was a very interesting structure. As military historians would realize, it was a command within a command, something that is not normal. So you had Air Headquarters at one end, and you had Air Headquarters Bengal reporting into Air Headquarters India. Well, more interestingly, it was unauthorized. He did not have the sanction from Air Ministry to do this. It did land him into trouble, but finally he could get his way around because people realized that what he was doing was very, very important for the war in the East. In parallel, let's also take a step of what was happening with the IAF. As you all know, the Indian Air Force was just one squadron strong for nearly a decade in its existence. From April 1941 till December 1942, another 6 squadrons were formed. So the Indian Air Force, broadly coinciding with the Pierce era or a little more than that, grew from 1 squadron to 7 squadrons. As a result of this growth, some of the pioneering officers of the Indian Air Force got some very good organizational experience. In fact, Subrata Mukherjee was Wing Commander Ops at Air Headquarters between November 42 and August 43, which coincided with almost half the term of Richard Pierce. Just imagine the amount of organizational experience he would have got, leaving him in a very good position to help out when he later became the chief or the chief architect, even before that, of the Indian Air Force. Awan and Majumdar, unfortunately, would not see independence for us, Awan having left the Air Force and Majumdar having died in a tragic accident. Pierce's tenure ended in September 1943, roughly 18 months. From being a few squadrons, we had now become a 35 squadron strong Air Forces in India. And I deliberately use the term Air Forces in India because Indian Air Force was still a small part of this. It was mostly RAF operating here. 18 out of the 35 squadrons were facing east with the 221 and the 224 group. This is really what Pierce had achieved in a small period of 18 months in a sleepy little billet that Air Headquarters or Air Forces in India used to be before his tenure. I'll pause here and just recap. India was just Northwest Frontier Province, and within a few months, it had now truly moved to be all of Indian subcontinent as far as the Air Forces was concerned. From just a few squadrons to 35 squadrons and integrated into the RAF global system. This structure is what IAF would eventually inherit, a large part. And therefore, this is where the birth of IAF's current structure would come. Moving on, back to 1943. Okay, I'm hearing a comment that I'm not audible. Is that clear? Am I audible?
We are able to hear you, Anchit. You're loud and clear. We can hear you clearly.
Okay, thanks, Aparna.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yep. So back to September 43, and that is the time when Pierce leaves India as AOC&C Air Headquarters. However, this was just not enough. The 35 squadrons that we had put in place, despite all the growth that had happened, was just not enough to push the Japs back. And the Burma front was very much alive at that point. And therefore, so came the Allied Air Forces. The US came in, the Australians came in, the New Zealand, the Canadian Air Forces, they all decided to land up in Burma. And to eventually help with this entire structure, a Southeast Asian command was formed with Lord Louis Mountbatten as its supreme commander. This was a command that had all the forces at his disposal, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, and the entire region of Southeast Asia, including the Indian subcontinent, was put under his charge. Not surprisingly, it was the Southeast Asian Air Command. It was Pierce who was put in charge of it. He had moved from India to be in charge of Southeast Asia Air Command with his seat at Colombo. And he immediately went about making changes. By the end of his tenure, this is how his orbat looked like. He had multiplied that command within command structure and had grown this is just the India subcontinent part. I'm not talking about what happened in Southeast Asia. In just the Indian subcontinent, he had grown into 5 headquarters and 11 groups. That was the pace of expansion, from 7 to 11 groups and 5 headquarters. I'd like to pay attention to four things here, or rather two specific things, and we'll talk about more in a bit. The first is Air Headquarters. Air Headquarters had actually been demoted in responsibility. From having to look at the full of the Indian subcontinent, they were now back to just looking at Northwest Frontier Province. And therefore, the billet was downgraded from an Air Chief Marshal to an Air Vice Marshal. They had two roles: to look at Northwest Frontier Province, which the 223 group was managing, and to mentor the Indian Air Force. The second aspect that I'll highlight is Air Headquarters Bengal was now also with the headquarters for the 3rd Tactical Air Force under Air Marshal John Baldwin. This was very interesting as angle for Indian Air Force. Most of the Indian Air Force squadrons who performed in Burma operated under this command, either with the 221 group or with the 224 group, depending on their location and role. And therefore, it is in this period that we noticed many of the Indian squadrons spending time with John Baldwin. And he was very, very appreciative of the effort that Indian Air Force put in. As you all know, many of the Indian Air Force officers who served during this period received gallantry awards. That aside, by the end of World War II, what Pierce had done to India was nothing short of fantastic. We had moved from being 15 airfields to 300 airfields, from 1 group to 11 groups, from operating in a tiny speck of Northwest Frontier Province to operating all the way from Karachi to Colombo to Burma, all in a period of barely 3 years. This was Pierce's gift to India and the Indian subcontinent. And this is the story that has been forgotten and should be told again and again and again till it is remembered. But this still does not answer the question I set out for. So let's continue. Post-World War II, there was another very interesting dynamic playing out. The air forces in India needed to shrink because they were no longer needed. And so a post-World War II plan was drawn up, which broadly summarized that we need 20 squadrons in the country, 10 of the RAF and 10 of the Indian Air Force, with some support ancillary flying units in addition to that. This was a significant reduction from what it used to be earlier. To manage only 20 squadrons, you didn't need the higher organization that existed in the Air Force at that time. And therefore, changes were made. The first was that the Air Headquarters in India was reborn to take its original avatar of being the overall in charge of the Indian subcontinent. This change was effected somewhere in early 1946. Further, all the 11 groups were decoupled with the RAF system of numbering in the 220 series and were renamed back to Indian groups. So either the 1 Indian group or the 2 Indian group or whatever be the number. But the most interesting thing was that they amalgamated 11 groups back into 4 groups. And this was some learning that they had had during the war. Due to the presence of multiple groups who had overlapping boundaries, they realized communication was a problem. The second problem they realized was that these groups were not co-located with the army, and therefore there was problem in communication and management. So now, as early as 1946, and this has relevance for modern day Army, Air Force cooperation as well, they had decided that they would co-locate the 4 Air Force groups with the 4 Army commands. The 223 group, which was in Northwest Frontier Province, remained very much there. The 227 group was at Agra, where the Central Army Command was. The 228 group was in Barakpur, was to move to Ranchi. And the 225 group was in Bangalore at that time, but was likely to move to Pune, where the headquarters of the Army Command was also likely to move. So this, ladies and gentlemen, was the setup in the post-World War era that India was supposed to inherit. However, let's pause and let's again just be sure of where we are in the journey. After the Pierce era has ended, we have seen a reduction in the Air Force's size. We have gone down to a peacetime force of 20 squadrons. We've had 4 groups now co-located with the Army commands, and we are back to the Indian nomenclature. And Air Headquarters has been put in charge of all of India, minus Burma and Ceylon, which are now becoming more independent. But there were two decisions that would not allow the post-World War II plan to be put in motion. The first was that RAF was to leave India. As the independence loomed, it was obvious that the RAF would leave the subcontinent, which means that out of the 20 squadrons that were originally envisaged for India, only 10 would remain. The second change was that India had to be partitioned, which means that even the 10 squadrons that India had were going to be split up. So all of a sudden, in a short period, while you have just completed a shrinking activity of the establishments, you are now forced to shrink it again. How do you plan for this? And this is all happening, by the way, in a period of a few months. The post-World War II plan had just been put in motion towards the early part of 1946, when the news that you have to change and again came in. The first change that came about was that the number 4 group was disbanded. The number 4 group was supposed to be co-located with the army. It was called the 227 group at Agra. And when they disbanded the group, they downgraded it to a wing. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why the number 4 wing of the Indian Air Force in modern era finds itself at Agra. And this is also the reason why the number 4 wing chronologically came up before the other wings. But coming down from 4 to 3 wings was not sufficient. They had to do more. So the number 3 wing group was also disbanded. The number 3 group was at Barakpur, was supposed to move to Ranchi, but eventually they downgraded it to a wing and moved it to Palam. And that is how the number 3 wing as the number exists for Palam. Now you're down to 2 groups. And no longer can you hold the narrative that I would be co-located with the army commands. You just do not have the size of the air forces in India to do that. And so again, we revert back to the system of having functional groups. The 2 groups that we are left with, the number 1 group and the number 2 group, are renamed as 1 being an operational group and 2 being a training group. The operational group in charge of carrying out all flying operations, whether it is combat or transport, and the number 2 group in charge of carrying out all training. By the middle of 1947, somewhere around June, this is how the structure finally looked like. To the left of the chart are the units and the stations that were part of the number 1 Indian group, which was the operational group. If you will see, it will have all the flying units and the flying stations. To the right of the chart are the number 2 Indian group, which all the training units and the training bases had moved to. So finally, after all the yo-yo of World War II, partition, independence, it seemed that the air forces in India had come about a structure that it was ready to live with. Well, not so. There was another twist in the tale. And the twist in the tale was that the 1 group was based in Peshawar and had to go to Pakistan. And therefore, what we were left with in the Indian side of the subcontinent was only the 2 group. It was in this light that independence happened. So on 15th August 1947, the Royal Indian Air Force, as it happened, had only 5 higher defense establishment units above the level of a squadron. The air headquarters at Delhi, and let's not forget, gentlemen, ladies, air headquarters at Delhi is still structured as a command. It is not structured as air headquarters because that is the RAF system that it was following. The number 2 Indian group at Bangalore, the number 2 wing at Pune, the number 3 wing at Palam, and the number 4 wing at Agra. And this is also the reason why there did not exist a number 1 wing at independence. Now, this still does not answer our question of why Meher Singh was AOC of number 1 group in India. Well, we all in India have the love for 1 squadron because it was the first squadron that the Indian Air Force formed in 1933 to be precise. Well, the officers of that time actually also had a similar love for 1 group because it was a group that existed from 1928. So just like India recreated 1 squadron, they also recreated or revived 1 group. As soon as independence happened, even though the original 1 group had been left behind at Peshawar, the Indian Air Force recreated one group. And at the helm of one group was put Meher Singh to wage the war at Kashmir. And it was in this light that he won the Mahavir Chakra of the being the AOC of the number one group. It was also here, as part of the Kashmir war, that the Indian Air Force had to move north to Srinagar to wage operations from there. And when they moved north, they realized that they had to set up a new wing. And therefore, Srinagar or Jammu to begin with, and then Srinagar became one wing. That is why one wing was actually the last to be made out of the first four wings. And that is why it happened at a place in Srinagar, which earlier was not a place of operation for any of the air forces, whether in the World War II era or even prior to that. So this is the long history of how the air forces in India came about and these nomenclatures. Let's just move on a little bit to understand what happened subsequently. The number two group, ladies and gentlemen, is still at Bangalore and is now in charge of training. In September, Air Commodore Narendra takes over as its first Indian commander, taking over from Air Commodore C.D. Adams of RAF, who returns back to the UK. Soon after, the Indian Air Force realizes that it needs to upgrade the groups to command, because that is really the parity that it was having with the army in terms of role, in terms of setup. And therefore, when the number one operational group was upgraded to a command, it took the name of operational command. And when the number two training group was upgraded, it took the name of training command. One more parallel change happened at the same time. And finally, Air Headquarters moved from being a command to a genuine headquarters. Most of us do not realize that this change did not happen in 1947. It finally happened in 1949. For the longest time, I was confused that why did Air Commodore Mukherjee carry the designation of a SASO while he was at Air Headquarters. SASO is usually a designation that is associated with a command. And the reason was that it was still carrying the billet of command. It was only in 1949 that it was made Air Headquarters in the true form of how a headquarters should be. And so we've come the full circle where Air Headquarters is finally Air Headquarters, the groups are finally commands, and the two numbers that we have are gone. Therefore, the most telling insight that I have is that our oldest institution is not the number one squadron IF. It is the number one group. It goes back all the way to 1928, got renamed to number 223 group in 41, back to number one group in 45, made an operational group in 1947, the operational command in 1949, and today lives as the Western Air Command. Most of the Indian Air Force history does not go back this much. It only thinks that the one squadron was the oldest one we had. Similarly, while not going back as much, but the training command goes back too. The number two group was actually formed in 1940. As we all saw in the evolution, it was renamed number 225 group in 1941. Then the number two group in 45. Then the functional designation of number two training group, and finally became the training command in 1949, which is the name with which it exists even today. There is a very interesting angle around this. The number one group name somehow existed in the MOD dictionary and directory. And the Air Force very kindly used this name 3 more times. When it created the Eastern Air Command in 1958-59, it used the name number one group. As most of you who have served in the military would know, it is a very difficult task to get additional establishments from the Ministry of Defense. And so when there is a file that exists with a number one group establishment, they used it to recreate establishments again and again. In 1962, when the Chinese were at our doorsteps, the Air Force just a month prior created the number one group again at Tezpur. It was a short-lived affair. And finally, in the early 70s, at Jodhpur, when the Southwestern Air Command was to be formed, it was formed as number one group. So in all the nomenclature, number one group was used 4 times in independent India, again and again. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, towards the end of this short expose on how the establishment that we came to inherit. Air forces in India were just in Northwest Frontier Province for nearly 20 years of their existence. They expanded rapidly between 42 and 45, shrunk back in 45, 46, and were partitioned in 47. Lost to everyone who talks about history is that WAC, Training Command and Air Headquarters ancestry go back decades prior to 1947. And I have been saying this story at different forums, and I'll continue to say this again and again till it becomes part of the official history. Also unsung in the Indian context is the role of Richard Pierce. His personal life aside, he was the one who actually got us this entire infrastructure that we now live through. With that, I'll stop and I'll be open to questions and go over any of these. And I realize that Sri is on the call as well. So anything that I do not know, you have the best man to answer those questions.
The floor is open. You shoot your questions. He has himself expressed his.
Very educative presentation, Anchit. And frankly speaking, I didn't know Pierce. That he almost, what do I say? He laid the foundations for our Indian Air Force. It's a huge information to me. When we talk of the Royal Air Force and the RAAF and all, we had the United States Air Force also operating, but they never got integrated with any of these forces.
They did. They were part of the Air Command Southeast Asia. So the Tactical Air Force, the 3rd Tactical Air Force at Bengal had elements of the US Air Force also as part of them. And John Baldwin, Air Marshal John Baldwin was reporting to them. They also had another entity called the Eastern Air Command, if I'm not wrong, which was not the same as our Eastern Air Command, a different one, which also had elements of the Air Force operating within them. They did get, they were part of that.
Because what we know about the United States Air Forces, they left behind lots of liberators, which became our first, which we actually rebuilt and used them as first bomber squadrons.
Absolutely, absolutely. So they did operate in large numbers and they left behind some of their equipment, infrastructure, and they operated a lot from the east.
Yes. But they were integrated with the command, under Pierce. It was under Pierce.
Absolutely. Everything that operated in the east was under him. The entire Southeast Asia Air Command, any Commonwealth Air Force operating there was under him.
Right. Thank you, Anchit.
You have a question, Aparna?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Anchit, I'm curious to know when the RAF left India and moved back to the UK, did a lot of the officers and everybody just go back? I mean, did we have enough Indians in the Air Force at that time, or did many of them stay back and then Indians joined the Indian Air Force? I'm just curious to know.
It was an interesting debate. In fact, I'll forward to you a link of how the first Indian Air Force chief was chosen. A lot of to and fro on how it was chosen about. There were two coteries. One wanted the RAF to go back in entirety and the Air Forces being managed by Indian officers only. And then there were some, including Nehru, who believed that we did not have the depth or the administrative experience to run an Air Force independently, and therefore we should have a senior officer stay back. As you know, Subroto Mukherjee and SP Engineer, the two senior most officers, were barely group captains at that time, and young group captains at that. With very few years of service for a typical group captain. And therefore, 5 to 6 officers of RAF did stay back at senior levels, especially as the chief. In the technical side, on the logistics side, where we did not have any ability at all, and to begin with in operations as well. By 1952-53 is when it was fully manned by Indians and these handful of folks. Similar was the situation with Pakistan, who opted for a similar approach, and it was AVM Perry who went to Pakistan. He actually could have been in India as well, but that's the other story of how the first Indian chief was chosen.
And another question similar to in the same vein is in terms of equipment that they left behind, was it, how did that happen? Like how many aircrafts they leave? What kind of equipment did they leave behind for the Indian Air Force? And I'd like to understand a little bit about that as well.
Well, they left behind everything that they thought was outdated. Not that they'd given anything contemporary to India in the first place. So they left behind a lot of ground equipment, technical equipment, the liberators, for example, which were mentioned earlier, and everything else that they could not take back. In fact, there were Dakotas as well that they left back for us. Some of it was usable, but only for a few years, not for a lot. I mean, there are stories of how, Liberators is a classical story of how Indians were able to recreate some of that to its advantage. But this was only for a few years that they could use. Most of the equipment was fairly outdated.
But Anchit, we had some of our cities had paid for these aircraft, like the Bombay Squadron and the Madras Squadrons. And the city of Madras and the city of Bombay had paid for these Spitfire squadron. I think it was the Spitfires. We paid for them. And did they take that back?
Yeah, because those squadrons were not part of the Indian Air Force. They were part of the Royal Air Force setup. Most of these were paid for by because I think we just had to, right? The principal states and the rulers of those principal states were aligned to the British, and they had to do what was required to help the British in the war. But these were not part of the Indian Air Force setup at all, and therefore did not belong, or Indian Air Force did not have any right. They were never manned by the Indian Air Force pilots as well.
All RF squadrons.
Yes.
Question: when the partition happened, whether major aircraft was left on Pakistan side because of a lot of Air Force quarters were there in Pakistan side. Peshawar, Quetta, all the other place. Is it true?
Sorry, sir, I could not understand the question. If you could just repeat that.
When the Britishers Royal Air Force left India after partition, majority of aircraft was available to Pakistan over to India. Is it correct? I'm asking.
No, sir. There was an armed forces committee that was formed to preside over how the resources would be split. And the resources were broadly split in the 80-20 ratio in favor of India. Having said that, physically, some of the aircraft were lying in Pakistan because a lot of the infrastructure, Peshawar, Risalpur, Karachi being major bases was there, and some of the infrastructure or some of the aircraft were in India, and they had to be interchanged. And there are some interesting stories of how that interchange happened or did not happen at that time. There is some, I have not been able to completely get to the bottom of this, but there were about 26 Dakotas, which could not be transferred for a while between India and Pakistan due to misunderstanding of how they were to be split. But by and large, other than that, the split was on the lines of what the Armed Forces Reconstitution Committee spoke about.
Okay, thank you.
Anchit, there's a question in the chat box. Is it possible to trace back the history of the air defense network to the pre-independence World War II setup?
Yeah, this is something that very recently I summarized in a Times of India article. But the bottom line is that there actually was no air defense network, to be honest, prior to World War II. It was felt that India did not need an air defense network, whatever be the belief of the British system at that time. This little bit of air defense network that existed for World War II related effort in Burma was destroyed, sabotaged. And it was, again, just like the Liberators, it is a story that needs to be told of how the first few radar squadrons were recreated by Indians using the sabotaged equipment and salvage. The first radar unit was actually set up in Palam. People don't know that. They ended up setting up 7 radar units before fresh equipment came up in the 50s from the UK again. But the air defense network was negligible.
I have another question. And given that this early period was also the period of independence, and the political bosses had so many things to deal with in a newly formed country, did the Air Force at that time suffer from not having the kind of budgets that were required to beef up the force in a way that maybe in 62 it might have helped us, if at all the government had chosen to use air power in that war? Was that anyway sort of a drawback?
What could have been used, Aparna? Sorry.
No, what I'm saying is, was there a lot of, did the government not spend enough on beefing up the Air Force in that early period post-independence? Do you think that might have impacted our participation in the 62 war, if at all the Air Force had been used in that war?
No, I think if we look back at the acquisition track record, the 1950s was the most prolific. We acquired more than 10 new types of aircraft, the Hunters, Vampire, Gnats, Canberras, numerous transport aircraft, introducing choppers. All of that was done in the 1950s. I think what we did not have sufficiently, and we were inferior on, we did not have sufficient air defense. And again, it probably this is my guesstimate. Probably it was not because we didn't want to acquire it. It was just because it was not available to us. The technology was not made available to us, and the Americans made it available to Pakistan, who had a superior air defense network. But from an acquisition point of view, the Air Force went whole hog. I have not seen a more prolific acquisition decade than the 50s.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Anchit, I have a question.
Please.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. It's nothing to do with what you have spoken. Air Marshal Vartman said that you're a keen off-roader. Can you just tell us what vehicle you use and a little bit of experiences of your off-roading, if you don't mind?
When you switch on the video.
Sure. So we are a group of friends who do this. I've been doing this for about a decade. The cars keep varying, but there is the Land Rover, there is the Jeep, there is the Endeavour, to name a few that we have used, all of them with off-roading pedigree. We tried different terrains, which are not in areas that are not mapped out per se on Google or on proper roads. So we've tried the extremes of Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal, Uttarakhand, different terrains on that side, Spiti, Kinnaur, Leh, Ladakh. We've also almost covered all types of desert terrains. And we've also done the monsoon mania and the ghats when there's all mud and slush. So, but happy to go into details of this on a separate note whenever we are able to speak.
More questions, gentlemen?
Was Andaman-Nicobar part of the planning during the British time?
No, Andaman-Nicobar was, I would call, an accidental base. In fact, I can forward you another of my Twitter stories which talks about how Andaman-Nicobar came about and became a base for the Indian Air Force. But it was only in 1942-43 as part of the World War II when the British realized that Andaman-Nicobar could be used by the Japs to launch a strike as a hop, that they started to create some infrastructure there, very rudimentary. And Japs did capture Andaman and Nicobar and kept it under their control for a while, till as part of the end of the World War II, the British came back. But it was only used as a staging base and nothing more than that. In fact, it is the reason why the only establishment in the Indian Air Force to ever be called a staging post, #1 staging post, was Karnik. Because we just inherited what the British named it as, a staging post. In fact, after independence, we had given Andaman and Nicobar to the British only, at least from an Air Force perspective. The Air Force enclave at Karnik was managed by the British. Till in 1952, some of our more enthusiastic members of parliament realized that this was not in line with our national ethos, and we were supposed to take it back. So when the Indian Air Force was hurriedly asked to take back the base from the RAF, in our usual uncreative ways, we renamed it as 1 Staging Post Indian Air Force. And that is the name it retained till 1983, when finally a wing was formed there, and now it's called the 37 wing.
Whose gift was it, the innumerable number of airfields or airstrips in the tea gardens of Assam, Nifa and all those areas to support the Burma operations?
I would say Pierce. It was in Pierce's era that all of this setup happened. There was nothing in the east. There was no reason for, as I said, the easternmost base till 1941 was Ambala. There was nothing east of that. So all of it is that came up in the Pierce era. The good news was that some of the tea gardens already had these rudimentary airstrips because that was their only way of communication to the rest of the world, and they were rich enough to afford. So that is why we saw so many of these airstrips there. So some of the airstrips predated the Pierce era, but to bring it all together in a usable network was his brainchild.
In fact, I'll just add to Anche. We recovered quite a few of those bases, not all, I mean, there are plenty left. And one of the latest one is Panagarh, which is now called, what do you call, Air Chief Marshal of the Indian Air Force, Arjan Singh Air Base at Panagarh. That was the last one that we recovered. It is actually the USAF used it in the Second World War, and we have recovered it. It's an ultra-modern base today. Like that, most of the eastern bases we managed to pick up, but there are plenty more lying, plenty more. And many of them have been, what you call, infiltrated and taken over by the population.
So as part of the shrinking of the post-war setup, the post-World War II setup, there was DGCA was handed over most of these airfields as they were, as the Air Force would like to term it, surplus to our needs. And most of these air bases were given away to DGCA. Some of them then were taken back, like Amritsar, for example, or Adampur, for example, earlier on, and Panagarh, as you spoke about, were taken back as and when the need arose. DGCA also did not have the security apparatus to take care of them, so a lot of them were, to your point, taken up by various people.
In '62, the Teju airfield was very much used, shall we say, strip for the induction of troops to the eastern sector.
Yes.
Sir, coming up in the chat box, Jit, I suppose the air defense of Calcutta was looked after entirely by an RAF 2 fighter squadron raised specifically for the purpose. It was stood down after World War II, and I guess it has no connection to the Vampire night fighter squadrons which were raised post-independence. How do you comment on that?
Yeah. So I think, Ivan, the air defense I understood in a different manner from a ground air defense setup. And I answered it from that context. Of course, there were squadrons that were raised. The number 8 squadron of the Indian Air Force was the first squadron to ever be given the air defense role. And that is why it carries the 2 O's in its pursuits. The 2 O's being the 2 I's that it was as an air defense unit. Till then, every unit of the Indian Air Force was a Army cooperation unit. So they were absolutely, to your point, there were squadrons that were raised. Shri adds that during World War II, there were a sum total of 2 radar units in all of Air Force.
You have any more questions?
Excellent session. Excellent session.
Thank you very much, Anjit, for a brilliant presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
I enjoyed it and wonderful. Hope have you some other time again with us. Now, if there are no more questions, you could go ahead with the national anthem.
Yes, sir. I'm just playing the national anthem, sir. जलधितरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मागे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय जय हे Thank you so much, Anchal.